Hello, welcome back to Stalin Origins, the podcast in which we look at history and how it can influence what we do today, how it has influenced what we do today, and how it can improve the way we design instruction to improve others' performance. I'm Alex Salas, your host, an instructional designer and learning and development practitioner. Today's episode is a good one. It's a very popular concept out there, sometimes defined as a myth, sometimes looked upon as a bad practice per se, but there is something to be known about Dale's cone of experience. So it's called Dale's cone of experience because we're talking about Edgar Dale, one of the most prominent proponents of audiovisual instruction, audiovisual education, and obviously something very close and knit related to learning and development today, as many of the practices, people working remotely will have to depend on instructional media to get their learning, get their information, and what they do. So it's interesting because if you were to Google Dale's cone of experience at this point, you'll probably find quite a bit of misinformation, tons of misinformation, as the original model, as it was explained by Edgar Dale, was modified with additional labels and percentages. It transformed from a audiovisual instruction model to a retention knowledge graphic. And I think that's the most important part to discern when you're looking at it and giving it a fair shake. There is a ton of value in reading the book published by Edgar Dale in 1946, Audiovisual Methods in Teaching. In this episode, if you check the links in the description, whether you are in Spotify or any other podcast platform, you'll find the links to all the sources that we're discussing today. There are a few sources to discuss in terms of the concoction of the cone of experience. The primary source, obviously, is the book Audiovisual Methods in Teaching, originally published in 1946, revised twice. And the link that you have today is in the Internet Archive, from the Internet Archive, and it's the third edition of the book done by Edgar Dale. So the intent today is to take a look at the book, the actual essence of the cone of experience, what the purpose of the cone of experience actually is, what it's meant to do, how can you use it as an instructional designer or teacher, because it has both purposes, and then how to avoid using wrong information and providing misinformation without any research, facts, or evidence as to the labels that you'll find today online regarding the cone. So I think one of the main things we can do in terms of Edgar Dale is to establish some credibility. Professor Dale was a prominent educator, not only in experience, but also in the work that he did that contribute to the publishing of his major book, and also the creation of the cone of experience for the purposes of using educational experience, instructional media. And it can be seen along his illustrious career. There's an article written by Robert W. Wagner, professor and chairman of the Department of Photography and Cinema at The Ohio State University in 1970. And it's essentially somewhat of a biographic account of Professor Dale and his work throughout, from being a teacher, a superintendent, and moving along to the world of research. Not only that, is that Professor Dale was heavily influenced by Dewey and his notion of experience or learning through experience, which I found new information here as well, missing from the earlier quotes about Dewey. One of the main quotes that Professor Dale deals with in the book is actually the full quote for Dewey in terms of learning by experience is, quote, learning through experience with thinking, close quote. So usually that doesn't come along. Most people say learning by doing or learning through experience and reflection, but the thinking part pretty much combines everything, and I think is super important to consider. Dale was very interested in the use of instructional media from the beginning. I think as a teacher, he sort of understood the key principles of communication and how that affects the learning experience as a whole. And he wrote different articles such as How to Appreciate Motion Pictures in 1933 and the Content of Motion Pictures in 1935. So at that time, in the beginning, 1935, you had somewhat of a use of different types of media for purposes, and the idea of using film for instruction. And perhaps one of the most influential pieces here is that during World War II, he was a consultant and coordinator for the Bureau of Motion Pictures of the Office of War Information. There are a couple of YouTube links I'll put in the description you want to check out from that actual department, which will be interesting to look at and learn from in terms of the push for instructional media. Of course, we can actually think then that there will be some kind of pushback, obviously, with the different movements, cognitivism, and everything else. As a matter of fact, Dale in his book states that he actually combines both methods in the way that he refers to Brunner's or J. Brunner's model of enactive, iconic, symbolic in terms of the growth of cognition, which is another major article here. So they are somewhat concurrent, and he borrows that into his book or makes mention of that. As a quick review of the book, the cone of experience is a culmination of creating a quick understanding of communication or creating a solid foundation of what communication is beyond messages and feedback, and adapting some of the effective factors in there for communication, the ability of certain groups of the experience of the individual in relation to the message, which is really interesting. So in terms of that, he mentioned that we should consider the following different groups in terms of how communication is received. In page 18 starts with, quote, we do not have common experiences, hence we may not be able to communicate because we are young, we are old. So that's the age factor. We're boys, men, girls. That's the sex factor. Keep in mind, this is 1970, 1969, third edition. So continuing with the quote, we are rich, poor, or in between. The economic factor. We live in a city, suburb, or farms. The location factor. So all these elements are cultural per se, and that kind of aligns with the thought process established by Brunner before. From this perspective, the cone of experience emphasizes the use of hands-on or direct exposure to experience and is reflected from the bottom up. There is no hierarchy per se, but there seems to be quite a bit of a misunderstanding, and especially because of the misinformation available online, right? So online, if you were to Google something online and find tons of pyramids and cones, because we know that people love pyramids and cones, the wrong interpretation, I would say, and this is for everybody to be informed, the wrong interpretation of this cone will be deviating from the original. So the original cone of experience is on chapter 4 of the book, and it starts at the bottom of it. So it's a cone with layers going up. If you can imagine, it's almost like a birthday hat. It's a cone, and in ascension you have from the bottom direct, purposeful experiences, and this is critical, right? Direct, purposeful. meaning with the purpose. And in the book, Dale is also a big advocate of systemic instruction, which at that time was pretty much at its height. That was only about 5 years prior to the release of the iconic ADDIE model, or the ADDIC within the ISP ISD model. If you go check it, check the episodes here. One of the earliest episodes before, we had discussion about the origins of ADDIE. So in this, direct purposeful experiences is really more about the actual purpose of the experience, meaning hands-on. And with that, you also provide contrived experiences going up. So it's almost as if I will list each of them and kind of break down things, but some of them are broken down into media, the other ones are broken down into experiences. In reality, it's all experiences, and it starts from the bottom with the concrete sort of a learning experience and the abstract learning experience at the top. At the bottom of it, we have direct purposeful experiences, but at the top you have verbal symbols. And ideally, the way you want to look at this is, okay, if you're going to learn something, what would be the best way to learn it? Would it be having a direct purposeful experience of that subject? Let's say you want to learn how to ride a bike. Well, that could be biased because riding a bike anything in learning combines all three domains of learning. If we refer to Bloom's learning domains in the sense of cognitive, affective, and kinesthetic. But riding a bike, you can consider a bike to be very kinesthetic, certain functions, keeping balance, moving. You're using your hands on the handle, using your feet to pedal. But they are cognitive processes as well as affective. So affective meaning the emotions and motivation that you have to drive a bike. As a kid, you probably learn how to ride a bike real quick, or really enthused to do it because you have friends that do it, and also it's a fun thing, and it's seen as a fun thing, and it's almost seen as we can probably think that it's seen almost as some kind of basic competence that you should have. Like maybe you may feel ashamed if you have I remember having groups of friends, and actually I didn't learn to ride bikes that early, so I may be ashamed of, divulging that I didn't know how to ride a bike among my friends, but those are things to consider. So direct purposeful experience at the bottom, and is the widest in the area of the cone, right? And then we have contrived experiences. So contrived experiences are those experiences that are not the real thing, but that provide you somewhat of an illustration or almost a sense of feeling of the real thing. And if you consider that, just think of all the physical models that you have out there in classrooms, like a globe, like DNA structures. They are physical sort of replicas of things. The old skeleton in the rooms, in the anatomy classes. So those are your contrived experiences. And then you have dramatized experiences, which still involve people into doing certain things and refers more to the crafts that he looks at, and then demonstrations. So if you notice, we start going from doing things and being active in the involvement, being involved and active in learning, and then we go through dramatized experiences, demonstrations. So from demonstrations, now you're not so much involved doing the thing, but a teacher may be showing you how things work, or an expert may be showing you how it works, how it's done. You have study trips above that. Of course, those are just, you may wonder or question any field trips you did back in the day, whether the field trip was more memorable because you were out with friends, some of your parents were chaperones, or because you actually think of now going back, that was a very key moment. So I say, I think I heard once Neil deGrasse Tyson talk about how he decided at 9 years old to be an astrophysicist, and that's because he was sitting on a planetarium. So whether he went by himself, he was super interested, or he was part of a field trip, I think that experience could be a defining experience for anyone. Then exhibits, which are pretty much your presentations. Educational television will be next, and that was pretty. That was something very relevant. I mean, if you're There might still be some samples out there where the educational television is, but in the 50s and 60s, that was quite supported in a big production, and that can still be seen in some YouTube links. Motion pictures, of course. In motion pictures, even without sound, so silent pictures were used in the beginning, and then with the incorporation of audio and everything else, motion pictures tell stories. So that is another way, another echelon that you think is higher, but really we need to think of this pyramid or this cone flipped upside down. And then you have recordings, radio, still pictures, the visual symbols, and at the top, verbal symbols. And one mention that Dale does is that throughout all experiences, text is involved, right? And words are involved. So it's not to think of it as some kind of fixed hierarchical thing. That's something he mentions as well in the book. And that is really more like a model of what perhaps teachers should be emphasizing. And I'd say as an instructional designer, it's really helpful to emphasize direct, purposeful experience whenever possible. That's basically what everybody preaches. If you hear any of the experts in learning and development, right? Relevant, something related to the workplace, something related to the actions that people will do, and, experience, meaning to be able to do the thing, to practice the actual task, to practice, to put into play whatever is being learned. So whether we look at a bunch of studies and experiments and whatnot, there's always going to be people telling you, no significant experience, no significant, let's say, statistical relevance, but we know this. And you can, even in the early laws from Thorndike, the law of exercise, the law of recency, those things kind of still apply into how the individual is able to learn and apply knowledge. So meaning law of exercise, if you don't use it, you lose it. And we know now, confirmed by neuroscience, that we do get weakness in the connections, in the synapses in the brain that link up to long-term memory if you do not practice the actual thing, if you don't revisit those pathways. So Dale's cone has some great guidance that perhaps was never really considered or looked at. Maybe my interpretations here are new to anybody, but really there's evidence in the book to kind of think of it in the way that I'm thinking about it. And so repeatedly through the book, Dale mentions that you need to go, that first of all, there's flexibility, but he actually mentions that you go from concrete experiences to abstract experiences, because the actual set of experiences below, the direct, purposeful, and the contrived experiences, you have to kind of involve and engage all your senses, and you have to involve and engage all your learning domains. So of course, you can probably think of many contexts and where this may or may not work. But the primary thing is that the experience, the ability to experience something, the availability to experience that, and then to be able to reflect on it and have the experience to then sort of complement your whole process of learning is perhaps the most powerful message here from Dale's cone. The one thing that we should definitely avoid is to think, well, people are going to learn the most by just doing stuff. 90% learn by doing, and 10% are visual symbols. That's not at all how Dale came up or conceived this model. It had nothing to do with retention in that perspective. This is strictly about teaching and instructional media, or with instructional media. And one thing to remember is that if you look at the literature, there's always seems to be somewhat of a resistance from certain groups of academics to rely too much on instructional media, because technically speaking, the instructor or the lecturer, the professor doing lectures, is instructional media. But if we introduce other elements such as film, television, e-learning now, right? Computer-based learning, which is mentioned as well in the book, computer-based learning. That is also instructional media. So it's almost like a scene at the time that people would reject instructional media in the sense that they think is a replacement for the teacher or the instructor. And that's not really the point. The point is that it should all be combined, and all combined can actually produce great results for the learning experience. So the last and most important consideration this is that if you are an instructional designer designing for adults, the Kona experience is really based on education and instruction for children. It doesn't really focus too much on adults and the difference between adults or not. However, we could see that with the emergence of other issues out there like learning styles, school systems keep teaching learning styles, people grow up believing in learning styles. You're probably listening and you may be a believer in learning styles in terms of preference. And again, we have to differentiate the design aspect of it and the learner aspect of it. So what you believe on your own terms as a learner obviously impacts your ability to learn, because you will limit yourself based on that belief. And from a design perspective, learning styles have shown not to really provide that much of a difference. If you design something because you think, oh, people are visual, so here goes a bunch of videos, or people learn better by reading, so here's a bunch of reading material. The reality is that the experience should be tailored based on what are the specific needs of the task. And that's something that Dale mentions in his book, where, again, referencing systems approach to learning and education, which I find interesting because, again, this is something that in his case, his target audience appears to be teachers, but it is discussing systemic instruction in the systemic instruction realm of what we see in performance improvement, what we see in terms of ADDIE, and all of that. So interesting, say the least. Really recommend you read this book. What do you think? Dale's Cone. After you read chapter 4, I put the link in here where you can actually get a free account in Internet Archive, which I recommend to anyone to check out for old materials or, historic materials. And what do you think? Has any value there? Does it provide any type of guidance? There's also a great article that I found over in e-learningindustry.com, and that is from Lubos Janoska. It was written about 6 years ago, and he breaks everything down again, sort of in the same fashion here that we discussed, where we have some kind of folkloric aspiration or some folkloric inclination to focus on retention, right? Like we remember 2 out of 10 things we hear, that type of thing. It seems to be that newspapers and articles before in the early 1900s published that. So the link to the article is also below, and discusses also the whole mention that we have with the cone of experience. So it's interesting from many respects. I think the key things to know as an instructional designer and learning and development professional is that Dale's Cone was not to be some kind of frigid or rigid instruction based or step-by-step locked hierarchy. He mentions in his book in chapter 4 as well that you can go from visual symbol abstraction to concrete experience and vice versa. It is really based on what task needs to be achieved. And there are some great depictions there of the use of symbols, the use of graphics, which is really helpful for visual graphic design, and labels, and where the text labels should be, which we know there's other evidence as well as other research from multimedia design principles by Richard Mayer. But Edgar Dale put sort of this notion up ahead and up front, and I think he was influenced obviously by his involvement in World War II, where there is documentary experience that film was a key factor in training people quickly and did much better than instructional design or the traditional methods we had for the folks that were drafted and were quickly sent to the battlefield. Of course, there's not really like the documentary experience is really more about, if you read the history of instructional design, parts 1 and 2 by Robert Reiser, which I'll also put the link here in the description. But unfortunately, there wasn't any, let's say, experimental data collected, although it was really recognized even by German officers that our capability to train quickly or know exactly what to do quickly was a key factor in how we defeated the Germans in World War II. Thank you for listening to Stylo Origins. This is Alex Salas again. If you have any comments or anything else, please drop them wherever you can, and make sure that you can contact me. It's been a pleasure again, and keep learning. We'll be back with more exciting episodes, and you can also leave recommendations in our newsletter that happens every week and is published on Sundays on LinkedIn.